Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the WhatsOnStage Podcast with me, Alex Wood.
And me, David Gordon from TheaterMania.com.
A bit of a rogue one there, because Sarah is still, not saying you're rogue, David, but Sarah is swanning it up in the Mediterranean. So we are in the reeds, still mucking it in theatre world on both sides of the Atlantic. We have brought you in as guest host for this episode, which might be quite a fiery one. I don't know. We've got some interesting topics to discuss.
I know. It was, when we were talking about it, I wasn't expecting to get as deep as it's going to, but I think it's going to be a good one this week.
So for audiences, in terms of what we've got coming up, this week was Burlesque the Musical's West End premiere. And for anyone who's been following UK theatre, there's been some choppier waters, but also now that the reviews are out, how that might shift the landscape of the show and what we can talk about with regards to it. Because as a previous episode stated, critics can't talk about a show before it hits press night. So we've kind of been quiet on the subject until now. But David, you've also had some interesting times as a critic over in America, which will be interesting.
I did. I took a trip to the Williamstown Theatre Festival in the Berkshires in Massachusetts, which is one of those historic yearly summer theater festivals here in the States. And I wrote reviews of two productions of two rarely seen Tennessee Williams plays, Camino Royale and Not About Nightingales. And one of them ignited a minor firestorm that I was not expecting, but not the same as what seems to be the firestorm of Burlesque, but we'll get there.
Yeah. It's so funny that any theatre firestorm really is all within a very small self-contained bubble a lot of the time, until like the tabloids come in and they start wading into matters. But I think a lot of theatre deal we like to trade within our own community, and we don't really like it when outsiders get involved in our beefs. I don't know if you think that as well.
Yeah.
Maybe it's different on Broadway. I don't know. There's a lot more attention paid to what's going on Broadway than I think that there is in the West End by the mainstream media.
Although I think Burlesque is going to be a notable exception, just given the title, the property, the fact that the movie had that cult following, the fact of Diane Warren's Instagram statement about the West End production, but that's getting ahead of ourselves, I think, a little bit.
Yes, right. So I will do the initial grounding for the story. So flashback to over a year ago, Burlesque the Musical's UK premiere was announced, and they were going to have developmental runs in Manchester and Glasgow, and then back to Manchester. Steve Antin, who is the director and writer of the original film, was on board to write the book with a variety of composers involved, including Jess Foley, who's also the lead, Todrick Hall, who was also co-starring in the show, and then Christina Aguilera, Sia, Diane Warren were some of the other names who were taking their songs from the film and bringing them to the stage. So that was where things began. And Nick Winston, who is a quite well-known theatre director in the UK, was on board to direct and choreograph. Sutra Gilmore, the designer, was on board as well. She's a long-term collaborator with directors like Jamie Lloyd, was producing the designs for those Glasgow and Manchester seasons. And by all accounts, those Manchester and Glasgow runs went really well because there were tryouts, things were being tested, the material was being experimented on. But huge box office success. I think it's pretty much sellout seasons everywhere. So the show was pretty much primed to come into the West End. Todrick Hall then was placed into the role of director and choreographer, and Nick Winston was taken off the project. So that started this sort of essentially what was a creative overhaul, so that then the team at the top was transformed, and the show was really sort of reinvented in anticipation for its West End opening. It was announced for the Savoy Theatre starting this month and coming after the closure of Mean Girls. Initially, another venue had been lined up, as Todrick Hall said in an interview, but that fell through, and then the Savoy came in, and so they had to kind of fudge their plans slightly in order to get that into position. And so that's sort of the piecemeal beginnings for Burlesque West End run. Then sort of rehearsals began with Todrick Hall as director and choreographer and star and co-lyricist and co-composer, wearing many hats. He wears more hats on the creative side than he probably does on stage as the fashionista Sean that he plays. There were rumours at this point that the costumes weren't completely sorted. There was also equity is confirmed to statements to the press in a story broken by the lovely Matt Hemley at the stage, that they'd been called in to investigate the production over a number of issues. But finally, the show this week made it opening night after previews. And by all accounts, it's like that's when the critics get involved. And up until that point, it's all like news conversation, it's features, but it's not the reviewers. Like the reviewers can't review the calamitous journey that a show has been on. They can only really review what happens on press night.
What a journey.
I know, I feel like that feels like my truncated version of Moby Dick that I've just managed to condense into 2 minutes of like exposition.
I want to say a couple of things first, just from a punditry perspective. I've been doing this for a very long time. It's 15 years this month, actually, that I started doing this. And I've seen shows come and go, and I've seen creative teams come and go. You don't really hear about a creative team being replaced in full or in semi-full with a lot of frequency. You only hear about it when shows are troubled, right? Like you heard about it a little bit with Spider-Man, where they brought in a replacement book writer and director for Julie Taymor. You heard about it with Devil Wears Prada in the West End, where they got rid of the whole creative team that did it in Chicago and replaced it with Jerry Mitchell and his general team, but they kept the writers the same. So for Burlesque to get rid of their director and choreographer and composer of the songs, even if they were songs that had been pre-written already, that's a lot. And that's not something that you see every day for a show that people have a lot of faith in.
A couple of points on that. So when I saw the show on Monday, the Diane Warren song that she had complained about in her now deleted Instagram post had been reinserted.
Oh,
into
interesting.
The musical. So it's done as a quick number by Orfeh, who plays Tess in the show, who's sort of like
Love
this
Orfeh.
Incredible Broadway veteran Orfeh, who is sort of like much loved in the theatre community, plays the role that Cher played in the film. So she's come over to do the role, and she does the song that Diane Warren composed for the film in the show, and it's much loved. And I think there was some controversy over it not being initially included during previews, but now it most definitely is in the show. And the other thing that I didn't mention is that the show also lost Sutra Gilmore, so a whole new designer was brought on. So the aesthetic has changed since the initial Glasgow and Manchester seasons. But like you say, it's very. I hadn't thought about the Devil Wears Prada comparison, because it's funny that I think if the show had originally done tryouts somewhere in the US and then come to the UK with this creative turbulence, I think it wouldn't have caused the same sort of headlines.
Right.
Possibly.
The only real changeover with Devil Wears Prada in terms of the writers is they brought on an additional lyricist, Mark Sonnenblick, because Shayna Taub was doing Softs on Broadway at the same time and couldn't be opening two musicals at once.
My current take on Burlesque, and obviously whatever investigations Equity has to do into the show, I'm not going to speculate on what those are about or what exactly the grievances were, but from what we can see about the show is that a lot of this is played out in the open where people can see it, and more shows than we probably realize have some pretty intense turbulence that does go on.
Right.
Even if it's not as extreme as Burlesque, you hear about stories about shows that have horrible preview periods or horrible rehearsal periods where they seem like they're heading into complete disaster, and then the show comes along and it's just like fine.
Yeah.
And it's like all that drama that happened beforehand kind of means nothing because the final product in front of audiences is totally acceptable. And one of the things that has brought that to new light, I think, in the last year is that Sonia Friedman documentary that she made for Stranger Things, The First Shadow, where basically the entire creative team was having a very intense time at the Phoenix Theatre. It was not the experience anyone wanted for that show. Yeah, it emerged with 5-star reviews, an Olivier Award, and so much love and excitement, yet it had this horrible journey to get there. So is it just part of the process that Burlesque has been the victim of intense scrutiny and some very public scrutiny when other shows are having the exact same situation, but it's not brought out into the open?
Todrick Hall and his level of fame, I think a level of fame like he has, even if it's within the theater industry, opens it up to a level of scrutiny. And with a title like Burlesque, it's not a production that has a huge corporation behind it the way Netflix was working on Stranger Things. So with Stranger Things, there was probably a level of being able to hide things and NDAs, and I don't really know what was going on there besides what was in the documentary. But there was probably a level of required secrecy that I don't think Burlesque necessarily had.
As they talk about in the documentary about, we can only actually use 10% of this scene because they want to actually use it in the TV series. So we've had to take all this stuff out of the show, which is, few people get to have to operate under those circumstances when they're making a musical or a stage play in Stranger Things' case.
Yeah. And I think, and it's also because people had seen Burlesque already in Manchester and Glasgow, I guess, that they knew what the show used to look like before this version. And there are those people who go to the first previews deliberately to trash things.
That's such a good point, actually. And, the first preview for Burlesque in the West End started like 45 minutes late.
Which is not unheard of.
No, it's not unusual. But then, there'd already been some rumblings about things not going entirely to plan before that. So this kind of reaffirmed that as the situation, and I think the show came down about 11:20 at night, which for Broadway is probably not too unusual. You guys end shows stupidly late, but for the West End, that's quite late.
Well, I was going to say 11 o'clock is the Broadway cutoff before everyone starts getting overtime, so shows have to come down by 10:59, which is why there's a proliferation now of 7 o'clock curtains and earlier. It's just so shows can come out faster and faster.
Which I'm totally for. I think shows should start as early as they can.
Me too. And we're both parents, so we want to be asleep early.
That's the thing. Yeah, we do. We just sleep is important because then you write a better review the next day.
Right.
The other thought I had about this production of Burlesque. So I have now reviewed the show. So that's the other thing is that after all this speculation and drama, I did actually sit in that auditorium and just think, okay, after all of that, this is just a musical now. This is just 3 hours of my life. I'm sat there, I'm watching a story being told. It's totally fine. The drama behind the scenes is far more interesting than the drama that's going on in front of me. And it's not a bad musical. It's not like a car crash. It's not a disaster. Is it the next Hamilton? No. There's more chance of me winning a Peabody Award for my casting announcement for Blood Brothers on Tour than that show winning a Pulitzer Prize for drama at any point, because it's like, it's not gonna be profoundly important. But I think at the end of the day, it's a totally average, fine show, and it's got some great performances. I think Jess Foley's really, really impressive in the show, and Todrick Hall's fine, and he's actually is quite a dynamic performer. You can, whatever, presence he has within the industry, he's actually just quite talented on stage. And Orfeh is Orfeh. You know that she's going to be brilliant. So when there's certain elements are in place, put these people in front of an audience, they're going to generate excitement and buzz, just because that's what musicals can do. Are there obviously some downsides to the show? Yes. I think that they put a faux proscenium over the entire stage, which makes the whole thing feel really cramped and enclosed, which this was the same venue that Sunset Boulevard, which has just closed on Broadway, played in the West End. And that venue never felt as small for Sunset Boulevard when they didn't have the proscenium, but they've introduced one here, and it suddenly feels very cramped. And there's other bits where the book is just really baggy, and there's just lots that just could be cut very quickly. And I think it's almost a case that someone needs to turn around and say, hey, you don't need this scene. Hey, you don't need that line. Hey, you don't need that random burlesque interlude. We could just cut all that and keep it going, pacey, fun. People are out for a good night. No one's coming to burlesque wanting to see something profoundly moving. They're there for the fun, the entertainment, and the joy of live spectacle. But yeah, it's funny how you kind of just, all of the stuff that came before just suddenly becomes a whole other chapter of the show's journey, because once it's reached opening night, suddenly, it is just a musical, and that's okay.
And then we save it for Fosse Verdon Part 2.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. And will people now talk about the mythic creative process that brought burlesque to the stage, where all this calamity apparently happened, versus what actually ended up being quite an average show? Are people seduced by the story of rehearsal turbulence and people at each other's throats? Do they want to find drama, even if the actual drama isn't that dramatic at the end of the day? But theatre people are also quite incendiary. It's a very interesting case study, I think, in so many different things. And it's funny that it's just a limited season that's doing a summer and then it'll be gone.
Yeah.
And, we're pandering to a phenomenon to some extent that will exist for a very short time. And then by the autumn, people will be like, oh yeah, Burlesque was on in the West End. I remember that. Whereas, the case will be closed.
Well, here's my question for you, and it's sort of an incendiary question. If the show was like bad, like the sense that I'm getting from you right now is that the show is okay. It's not the best show ever written. It's not the worst show ever written. Would you have rather the show be bad than just mediocre? Like if it was bad, would that at least make you feel something?
Well, it felt like a logical conclusion to the story of the rehearsals are going terribly, everyone's having a rough time backstage, equity has been called in, would be, oh no, the show is a disaster. That just feels like that's the natural trajectory. But for it to just be fine, kind of in a way is like, oh, okay, maybe we need to do the necessary investigations to make sure that all the right procedures were adhered to. But was there just a lot of noise made around something because people wanted to find noise?
Right.
And I think that is part of the problem, is that social media will leap on this bandwagon and start getting excited about something. And maybe I'm seduced by that as well. I'm a victim of that. I like the
we like the
controversy.
Gossip.
I like the drama. I think we all do. We work in theatre that fundamentally involves play, drama, high stakes, and unexpected turns and shocks. So I'd had a sense, and friends had seen it in previews. Some had seen it in early previews and said, God, this is a mess. And people had seen it later in previews and they're like, you know what, this is actually quite good now. And so I was like, okay, something is going on. You're using your preview period well to finesse your show and you're responding to your audiences. And fair enough to Todrick Hall as director and choreographer and the producers behind the show that they were taking the time to finesse everything and not just putting a car crash on stage and cashing in on the advance that they had. They wanted to make sure this show worked. So, that has to be admired to some extent. By the same token, I'm kind of glad that it wasn't a runaway success and it wasn't just like the best show to ever exist. Because I feel as though if there was something behind the scenes that Equity then has to investigate, I wouldn't want like loads of 4 and 5 stars to come in and say, look, this is absolutely amazing, because then does it then take the oxygen away from the fact that there needs to be some investigation into what's going on backstage?
That totally makes sense. I totally get that. I am personally of the mindset that I would rather a show be great or terrible, and that anything in the middle just is not for me. You know what I mean? It's like I want to feel something either way. Like if I went into Burlesque knowing what I know, and I don't know nearly as much as you, like I haven't followed the controversy nearly as much as you have, but if I was sitting in that theater and I was like, wow, this show is amazing, or wow, this show is just horrible, like I think personally I would feel better than knowing, all right, it went through all of this and it was just there.
Yeah, I think it was kind of that anticlimactic sensation of watching it, of just being like, oh, okay, I guess that's just a show then.
All of this talk for what?
Yeah, exactly. And, I think now is the point where what really needs to be addressed is, okay, if there were things going on behind the scenes that need to be addressed by Equity, we need to make sure the work is done to make sure they don't happen again. That, for me, is the only important takeaway that needs to be looked into.
Yeah.
But also, summertime in the West End, always dodgy. Audiences sometimes are just more keen to be out on holiday. They're going to be out in the sunshine. They're not going to be necessarily wanting to be cooped up in a theatre in central London in hot conditions. But Burlesque is selling well. And it's a new musical selling well in the West End. And that in itself is probably a good thing for a summer slot that most venue operators wouldn't even want to entertain. So, maybe everyone is getting the best out of this situation that they can do, given the circumstances in which it all began. Hearing from people that used to be involved in the project that have left, so some of the creatives that used to be involved, other members of the team, talking to them, most of the time they're just relieved that they're no longer on it, because it sounded like it was a very calamitous, chaotic journey. And at the same time, there are clearly people who do go out every night and get huge rounds of applause and get huge credit, and it's great. Jess Foley is absolutely amazing in the central performance. Hopefully this is a star turn, and it means that she's goes on to bigger things going forwards, and this is just the first step in her career. So all in all.
And you have Orphe just scrolting her face off, I'm sure.
Exactly. And she gets this brilliant 11 o'clock number, and then she just sort of like lets rip. And the whole way through, you kind of feel like she's like holding herself back. She's not really committing to this big voice that you know she has. And then like right at the end, it's like, boom, huge. And you're like, there it is. That's like case study in restraint. But giving the people exactly what they want when you think they want it.
Perfectly timed.
So exactly. And I think that I have to say, audiences around me, I wasn't there on opening night, so I wasn't there with all the friends and the family of the stars who are always going to cheer. They're always going to give standing ovations. You know, I was at Evita opening night where they gave like 4 standing ovations, and fair enough. I feel like they might have earned that. But here, it was a everyday Monday night audience. Monday nights audiences are famously quite reserved in the West End, as you might expect, but they were loving it. You know, they were having the time of their lives. They were responding really well to the choreography. They were responding really well to the gags, the one-liners. There was, I think, Todrick added like an improvised line about Coldplay and cheating. It was really funny, and everyone was on their feet laughing. Not on their feet. Everyone was sort of like in bits, even on stage. I think there was a little bit of corpusing about it. So it felt fun. And I think, again, it's like, well, if people are having a great time, who am I as a critic to then turn around and be like, well, actually, it's not very good, is it? So it's like...
And you know what I guarantee?
What's that?
I guarantee that the random people who are there for, you know, a bachelorette party, what we call a bachelorette party, what you call a hen do, I guess.
Hen do, yeah.
You know, the random people who are there for a night out are not going in to scrutinize it with the lens with which we scrutinize things.
Yeah.
They probably don't know any of this gossip.
Yeah, exactly.
The average audience member probably does not know anything that went into the making of this show.
If I sort of like stood up at the end of the show and I was like, guys, sit down, straw poll, how many of you knew that there was like an equity investigation into the show? I'd say probably about 10 people would have put their hands up out of the 1,500. Yeah.
Don't you miss being able to be an innocent like that?
Yeah. It's so true.
Isn't it nice to know a lot and a little bit not?
The curse of knowledge, yeah. But yeah, I think that opens up the wider point about the role of the critic and how much you do respond to the audience around you. Because, you know, if I was thinking, oh, that's not a very that number's quite I'm not really enjoying that. And then all of a sudden, hundreds of people around you start screaming with delight when the number ends. You're like, maybe I'm the one that's not got the like, maybe I'm not buying into this in the right way. I feel like that is my like mangled attempt to segue into your experiences this week because I think this especially since I've stepped back from reviewing or seeing as much for young parent reasons, it has made me spend more time thinking about the shows that I do see, because I just don't see as many. And that's really interesting that I'm only going to the theatre once every week or once every 2 weeks, as opposed to once every other night or once a night. And then it makes me think about the things that I've written about the theatre, because then I have more time to think about what it is I've written rather than just belting through like 6 or 7 reviews every few weeks like I used to do in the olden days. And it does make me think like sometimes the critic can sit in a different bubble to the audience.
I think that is 100% true, that the critic sits in a different, you know, in a different segment of the audience than the average theater goer. You know, I have a lot of friends who don't work in this industry. You know, a lot of people, my parents' friends, you know, they go to Broadway once every couple of months. They're, you know, average, you know, New York people who don't live in New York City, right? And there are a couple of them who come. I saw, you know, the Neil Diamond musical. I saw the Bobby Darin musical. Those are the shows that they're going to. And the shows might not be my cup of tea, but they love them. You know, the Bobby Darin musical was, you know, I thought it was okay. There are friends of my parents who thought it was the best thing they've ever seen, and the talent was off the charts, and they can't wait to see it again. And you know what? that's perfectly fine. They are completely entitled to feel that way. And they ask me what I think of it. And it depends on who I'm having a conversation with. If I'm having a conversation with you, I'll say, yeah, I didn't really like X show or whatever. If I'm having a conversation with, a friend of a friend who doesn't have the same level of knowledge that I have, and they'll say, I love this show, what did you think? I'll say, you know what, yeah, I liked it too. And I'll start peppering them. What did you like about it? What did you how did you think of this performance? What did you think of the set or whatever? And so that's just the way that I've taken on about it, because I don't like to really seem like a party pooper, because then someone asks you, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but someone asks you what you thought of a show and you're like, I hated it. And then you can see their face fall because they really loved it.
Yeah. Or they spent hundreds of pounds about to see it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I feel like that is a natural point in which to bring up your experiences this week, which I would say are quite unusual, to be honest. And I don't know how often you've experienced this. Do you want to explain what's happened?
Yeah. So I went, as I said, I went up to the Williamstown Theatre Festival this weekend in Massachusetts to see 3 shows, one of which is a new play from Jeremy O'Harris, who wrote Slave Play. It was a wild experience that I'm not allowed to talk about because it was not open for review. So I won't share any thoughts except to say I can't wait to see where it goes on the journey, because there is a lot in it. The acting was great. I think it has a lot to say. I think everyone will acknowledge, especially, and I spoke to one of the actors in it yesterday for an interview, who said they didn't get their final script until the night before previews started, which Jeremy has admitted to.
That's on the record.
And yes, it is on the record. He'd said it in an opening night speech when I saw it. And they were very transparent about it. And I'm just really looking forward to seeing where it goes on the journey, because I think it's really interesting and has a lot of things to say. Amber Heard, also fabulous. As the leading lady of the play, a real, Tennessee Williams-esque leading lady.
So the other 2 plays that you saw were also Tennessee Williams. So it sounds like O'Harris is in conversation with Tennessee Williams there.
He's trying to be, and the whole season that he's produced this year, because he's the creative director of the festival this year, is trying to be in conversation with Tennessee Williams. So it's 2 rarely seen Tennessee Williams plays. It's Camino Royale and Not About Nightingales. Not About Nightingales, which predates all of his plays. It was written in 1938. He was 27 years old. It is a drama about the need for prison reform in the United States, about convicts that go on a hunger strike and are eventually roasted to death in a steam-filled basement, basically. It was never produced until Vanessa Redgrave basically tracked down the script in the 90s. Do you know this story?
No, this is amazing.
Oh yeah, no, this is an apocryphal story. So Vanessa Redgrave was doing Orpheus Descending, and she had read in his introduction, I wrote this play called Not About Nightingales. It's the most violent, horrific play I've ever written. Never produced. He sent it to the Group Theater, which was one of the historic, political theater companies in New York. He sent it in the 30s. They turned it down. It was the first play with which he ever signed the name Tennessee Williams to it. And after reading about this play in the introduction for Orpheus Descending, Vanessa Redgrave decided to look for it. And she found it through Tennessee Williams' executor. And she basically cobbled together various drafts and put it together and got it produced in a co-production of the theater company that she ran with her brother Corin and the National Theatre of London and the Alley Theatre in Houston, Texas. And they did it in Texas. They did it in London, Texas, and New York. It came to Broadway. Corin Redgrave was the star. And it made a minor stir in 1999, I think. It got Tony nominated for Best Play. And then no one's given it a real first-class professional production, at least in New York, since. So I went up to see this play in particular because, no offense to people who love Glass Menagerie and Streetcar, I've had my fill and I want to see something different. And I was really stunned by the level of clarity that this guy who is 27 years old wrote a play about issues that are still being talked about today in terms of the way we treat the incarcerated in the United States. And I don't know how many people from the United States or the East Coast are listening, but I would very much urge you to go see this play, if nothing else, to increase your Tennessee Williams education. The other play I saw was Camino Real, which was written in the 50s. So sort of after, like, Glass Menagerie, and I think after Streetcar, but before Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Do you know anything about this play, Alex?
Beyond what was in your review, no.
Yeah, so this is a hallucinatory dreamscape at the end of town. It's sort of like the Twilight Zone, where once you're there, you can't leave. And it opens with, and it incorporates fictional characters from classic literature and characters that Tennessee Williams made up. It's so all over the place. It opens with Don Quixote being abandoned by Sancho Panza. And then Don Quixote falls asleep and essentially dreams this play about an American boxer who's down on his luck and desperate and trying to just sort of and finds out basically that he's going to die. And it's just sort of him coming to terms with that. There's an aging Casanova who's sort of coming to terms with the fact that he's finally fallen in love. The person he's fallen in love with is the tragic heroine Camille. It's Esmeralda from The Hunchback of Notre Dame is in it, and she goes through like a ritual where she recovers her virginity. Like, it's crazy. It's so strange. And the drawing factor for me for this, obviously besides the fact that I've never seen this play and I don't know that I ever will again, is the fact that Pamela Anderson was playing Camille, and she's great. And Nicholas Alexander Chavez, who is a young actor who I guess these days is best known for playing one of the Menendez brothers in the Netflix series Monster, is playing Kilroy, the American boxer. And it's got a bunch of like New York theater names. Vin Knight is in it, April Mathis, Henry Stram, like great New York theater actors. And I went to see it, and I didn't know what to make of it. As a theater goer, my preference is for linear storytelling. I make no bones about that fact. Everybody knows it. And I saw this, and my review was, I would call it mixed. I would not call it negative. I would not call it overtly positive. But my review was basically, be warned when you're seeing this. Your mileage may vary depending on how much you love nonlinear theater, depending on how much you love, trying to work for your money, basically.
And what happened next, David?
What happened next was I started seeing messages on Twitter, on X, adding me, saying, basically, the director didn't like your review, and he Instagram posted about it. This is a director named Dustin Wills, whose work I am a big fan of. I respect him a great deal. He's a young Obie winner. He's directed these cool plays called Wolf Play and Wet Brain. I've never really encountered him like in the wild before. Like, I've never met him. I've never had any sort of conversation. So I received a message from Dustin, the director, basically saying, and I want to do it justice. So I'm gonna let me pull it up right now, because I don't want to misquote him. What he basically says is, and not even basically, this is what he says: I don't often do this, but I found your review of Camino Real to be extremely cynical. This is so disheartening considering Tennessee's primal scream for sincerity, and especially at a time when the art of reviewing is in an absolute tailspin. The glibness and cheapness of this article is pretty insulting. I'd prefer a thoughtful pan over this. I will happily speak to you further about this if you have any desire. I've had enough of the cheap, cavalier attitude of criticism lately, and we have got to have a better conversation about art than this. First time I've ever gotten that from a director. Not the first time that I've ever gotten that from, someone involved with the show, but the first in a long, I don't even really get any sort of emails or notes about my reviews, directly to me on social media or whatever. But yeah, I saw it, and I looked at it, and I looked at what he then did a follow-up post of all of his criticisms about my criticisms. And his larger point was the review wasn't really thoughtful enough to encompass what he was trying to do what he thinks Tennessee Williams was trying to do. He thinks maybe that critics in general should be, outside critics in general should be replaced by artists criticizing each other's work, which is an interesting perspective. And what I instantly did was not, I wasn't like, oh, this guy's a meanie and my feelings are hurt. I saw that he said he wanted to have a conversation, and the first thing I said to him was, I would love to have this conversation with you. Because I've always believed that, if you can't take the heat, stay out of the kitchen, right? Like, I don't consider myself a public figure, but what I do is out there. Like, people are going to listen to this. People read what I wrote. I see the numbers on the reviews the traffic numbers on the reviews that I write. And I don't want to say that, every story turns viral, but, much as I don't like to think about it, these things are out in the world and have some sway in one way or another, right?
I like to think of it that when we do a review, it's almost like we're standing up in front of like a baseball stadium or something, and every single person in that stadium is reading what you're writing, and then you have to be answerable for every single thing that you said.
Right.
But what's unusual about this one is that he's actually responded to you in a very public way, and often I think creatives can be they might grumble on the sidelines or in private messages to their friends or even to editors, but they don't normally respond very vocally or publicly to reviews, which I think was quite a surprise.
And I thought I think it's very bold of him. There is some flack he's getting on certain message boards. People have privately messaged me about it. A lot of people have said, hey, I read that review and it was not bad.
Yeah. But do you think that you, listening to his messages and his concerns about criticism, it's almost like a wrong place, wrong time situation where you said the thing that broke the camel's back, so to speak, that this was something that he had as a theory already. It's just that your review was the one that ended up in the firing line.
Right. And I think it was partially because my review was the first one of his production to go up. And I think, making theater is hard. And when you've spent a lot of time working on something and you see that someone very publicly says they don't get it, whether it's your fault or the play's fault or whatever, yeah, I get it. I would be offended too. And I don't, a lot of people are like, are you mad? How do you feel about it? And I'm like, my philosophy has always been, I'm entitled to my opinion. He's entitled to his opinion. I would love to have this conversation with him about it. And I've told him that, and he said he was going to email me later in the week, and we'll see if he actually does. I don't know if he will, but we'll see if he does. But I really want to go through my review with him line by line and see what he thinks is cheap or glib or not giving enough credit where it's due. And I want to go through some of the finer points of the production with him to see what I missed. Because maybe, from my education, maybe what he's saying can clarify for me what I didn't understand.
Or vice versa. That's the thing is, I think that it can actually be a really rewarding conversation with a creative team member. If you say, oh, I didn't get this thing that you claim that you were doing in this production, maybe I'm not the only one that feels that way. Is there something that you can do in the show to clarify that point so that it makes it easier for people to understand what you're trying to get at? Because ultimately, the relationship between a critic and a creative shouldn't be combative. It should be constructive.
Right.
But far too often, I think the combative nature of it stands out that bit more.
I think there is a very combative nature to it. Because I think a lot of people think that critics are just, setting out to be meanies, for lack of a better word. And, we're doing this, specifically to rain on your parade, which is not true. I love theater. This is going to sound really silly, but I don't go into anything wanting to hate it. Do you?
No. Well, with Burlesque, whatever, like I said, whatever had come before, ultimately all I can review is what happens on the night. And
right,
you have to put everything else into a box to one side.
Right.
But it is funny how the preconception is of those nasty critics with their knives ready to say some unpleasant things when, we're also the ones that will write 1,500 word long think pieces and celebrate our favorite creatives that we've seen in shows, and we'll put in the time to advocate for them and help to support their careers. I wanted to get your take on this because I haven't spoken to Sarah about this on the podcast, but the New York Times recently is having this big creative overhaul with Jesse Green being repositioned. I can't remember what the term is. Basically, let go.
They're moving his department. They have not specified to where or what he'll be doing or who will be replacing him. They did sort of intimate in the big statement that went public that they were trying, and it wasn't just him. It was several of their big critics for TV music, I don't know what that's going to turn out to be. Mostly because what worries me about that is I'm not worried about who does the reviewing, right? Like, I like Jesse's reviews. I don't really know him as a person. I think he's a great writer. I don't always agree with what he's saying. There are certainly a lot of shows this season where my feelings and his feelings did not line up. But I think overall, his co-biography or co-autobiography of Mary Rogers, which is called Shy, is a great, great fun read, right? So, I don't necessarily care if it's him, if it's, someone who I've never heard of before or a veteran from a different publication going over there. What I want is for, it's sort of like what Dustin Wills was saying. I want for the criticism to be thoughtful, even though he didn't think that my review of his play was thoughtful. But I want the coverage to remain. I want the coverage to be solid, and I want the coverage to be able to showcase like what we all love about theater and why we do it. And what worries me is that by moving him away from that desk, the coverage is going to keep diminishing, because the New York Times doesn't, we at TheaterMania, and this is not to sort of toot our own horn, but we at TheaterMania are one of the few publications that still try to review as much as we can in New York City. Broadway, off-Broadway, off-Broadway, in a warehouse on the river somewhere, 5 subway stops away from the end of civilization, basically. We will do our best to be there. And that's a lot of credit to our critic, Zach Stewart, who is willing to spend every night of the week out going to these off-the-beaten-path theaters to be able to give that sort of coverage. The New York Times used to really do that, but they don't really do that anymore. And I worry that this is going to be a portend of an even diminished string of coverage, whereby we only get Broadway, and when they do cover Broadway, maybe it's only the shows with big celebrities in it. So that's what worries me about that. That's a whole separate conversation.
Well, and then it's interesting when creatives offer alternative models and say, why have critics when you can have creatives that can then write for publications and give their own verdicts on shows? Has the role of the critic either been transformed or eroded? And like, one of the interesting things that stood out to me from the statement is that they were saying, like, we're moving into a time where print reviewing is but one of a big assortment of ways that you can review a show. Like, you can do a video essay, you can do a social account. It doesn't have to just be, you can do that, you can do a podcast. Exactly. So then it's like, okay, if that's obviously great because that shows evolution, but is that at the expense of the critic or their expertise? Are you still going to be getting the critic that goes on the podcast, that goes on the YouTube video, that does the short TikTok video? And
is it going to be an expert, or is it going to be someone who has no background in it that just has a lot of followers?
Exactly. Brave New World and all that, we might turn around in a year's time and be like, the New York Times did this inspired move that actually reached people on platforms that don't currently read theatre criticism and got them engaged with the art form of criticism, because it is an art form, it is a creative process, in ways that wasn't being done 5 years ago. Like, we don't know that yet, but it's an interesting and precarious time for publishing, for criticism, for theatre. And anytime someone rocks the boat, you kind of assume the worst, I guess.
Right. And I just want to say, I know we were talking a little earlier about like Dustin Wills reaching out to me, and like it's an unprecedented move, but I give him a lot of credit, actually. And, I give him a lot of credit for speaking out and sharing his feelings, even if it was to just sort of vent, or if he meant it, or, if he will wake up tomorrow morning regretting what he's saying. I think I wouldn't have done the same thing, but if he wants this to start a conversation, I think is a vital conversation to have about what is the use of criticism in 2025, and what are the different styles of criticism in 2025. The way I look at criticism and the way that I look at TheaterMania and the way that I look at my writing, I'm not writing the same kind of review that you would see in a theater journal that can really go in and dissect a piece, line by line from top to bottom. I find myself writing, I think of myself as writing for a consumer audience who doesn't necessarily know a lot about a play, a lot about its history, a lot about its stars, and I'm telling them whether to see it or not see it. And there's value in that just as much as there is value in someone that is doing the kind of super in-depth analysis that you would read in a college course.
Yeah, well, I guess I feel like this is a point where we can call time on, I don't feel like we've supplied many answers, but we've definitely supplied a lot of questions, not only around what critics are doing, but also just, I think the burlesque chapter as well, it's like it's raised a lot of questions around working practice and also what critics can and can't talk about in reviews. And, also have to give another bit of kudos to excellent investigative journalists that will go behind the scenes and will amass the information. I'm sure there's still many going on trying to find out things that might be bad practice on certain shows, and they're going to hopefully be able to call things out if there is anything like that. But the way in which theatre journalism has eroded over the last 20, 30 years means that there's just fewer column inches for those sorts of stories now, and we have to find new ways to tell these stories. New ways to dream and tell these stories. Sorry, leaning into another Sunset Boulevard reference. I guess it is what it is, and I'm sure we'll have you back on soon, David, and we can find out whether or not you did have a lovely constructive conversation.
Part two of the story. Yeah, we'll see if there is
one.
I
hope so.
But I want there to be. Yeah. I genuinely want there to be. And, our boss and other people that I've spoken to are like, why do you want, they're like, you're not offended by this? I'm like, no, I think this could be a really great thing.
Yeah. Hopefully. This is just
hopefully.
This is the mid-act 2 crises of what could be a really lovely 3-act adventure.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up and say it's a goodbye from me, Alex Wood.
And me, David Gordon. Thank you for listening to my rambling this week. I'm not Sarah, and I appreciate your tolerating that.
Well, Sarah will be back next week with me, and then I think I will be off because Sarah and I are tag teaming our holidays on the continent. So in the meantime, make sure you follow, subscribe, leave a comment, rate the podcast wherever you can. We'll be back every Friday with a smattering of bonus episodes in between.